Welcome to episode 2 of the Center of the Rainbow Circle, which I guess is what I'm going to call it. It's a working title, I guess. But it's my way of recording for posterity's sake ideas about fiction that I developed over the years. And last episode, previously, on this thing that I'm doing, I talked about the importance of characters in a piece of fiction and why something has duration of stimulation. I don't want to explain all of that over again, is because of strong characters. But I was trying to think of other characters to really talk about, because last time I really just talked about Robin Williams' characters. And he's one of my favorite actors, so he has plenty of characters to talk about. But I was trying to think of other favorite characters, and today I thought of Jude Fawley, because I was listening to Seuss the musical with my son. And I had an idea years ago. I'll never actually do this idea, but I had the idea years ago to write the life story of Horton the Elephant from the Dr. Seuss books in the style of Thomas Hardy. But there are some basic similarities between Jude Fawley and Horton the Elephant. And actually, I think they explain the ideas of the rainbow circle. Here's my rainbow circle. I think they actually explain the ideas of the rainbow circle. One of the parts that sometimes is difficult to really communicate. As I said last time, it's a spectrum between duality and non-duality, which if you think too much about that, it's a bit confusing in and of itself. But sometimes when I disagree with people about basic concepts of how fiction works, the things I tend to disagree with is false objectivity, application of false objectivity, and that really has to do with, from the perspective of an artist. I'm a fiction writer, so therefore I try to, just for the sake of the thing I love most in the entire history of the world, blah blah blah, second only to my son, I tend to view everything from that perspective, and framing everything in terms of some universal claim that doesn't really, apply to all fictional work, is an ineffective way to really approach fiction writing. So a lot of the times those arguments come down to a very dualistic sort of argument. The dualistic argument being, on my side, I care about the feelings that a text elicits, and that's all that I care about. On the other side, people care about ideologies and ideas and concepts and what have you, and that's all people care about. And that's a very dualistic way of thinking about it, which is actually contradictory to what I'm actually talking about. And so this is part of where it gets confusing. And so, especially with my friend David, who owns a local bookstore, when we talk about comic books mainly, but our disagreements tend to come down to the idea that a particular comic book is about, I'm a bit sensitive about the word about. If somebody says, what is this about? I would say, I don't know that it needs to be about anything. But a comic is about this universal idea versus a comic is about the feelings that the characters are feeling. It's not really a dualistic split like that. It can actually be both. But from the perspective of a writer, the most important thing to really, at the core, this is why it's the center of the rainbow circle, because that's where the writer starts, or the artist starts. It starts with the feelings of the character, and it moves in a spectrum out to these universal ideals. But most of my favorite characters, here's where, in conversations with David, for example, I'll talk about my favorite characters, and they tend to be very idealistic. And if you're framing it in terms of an argument, that's sort of a gotcha hypocrisy. But that's not really how it works. Just because I like characters who are idealistic, that doesn't mean that's not an actual hypocrisy. This is my cat Bo really wants attention. Siku's smelling everything over there. But it really goes back to the same thing I was talking about with the Robin Williams video the other day, where what really works most effectively about the Robin Williams characters is not that he's comedic necessarily, that he's manic and crazy and wild and makes all these jokes. That's not necessarily the appealing part of it. That could be a temporary spike in stimulation that just burns out. What's really enduring about Robin Williams' character is that manic, jokey quality is a mask for the vulnerability underneath. Now, that's one type of character with that direct sort of paradox. And here's where it is on the I'm going to block Bo for a second. That's where it is on the rainbow spectrum. It's the second level. The center is just pure visceral emotional response, just giving over to the feelings. Giving over to the irrational feelings of a character, what have you. But a really effective way of communicating that is through this paradoxical counterpoint of two things that don't really seem to belong together, like really crazy, manic, jokey, comedic character, counterpointing that with a really vulnerable, sensitive, broken man, what have you. So really good Robin Williams characters work that way. So I do like ideological characters, like Horton the Elephant, and like Jude Fawley. And Don Quixote is just another, sort of a go-to favorite character. And I eventually want to talk about comics, but I thought I'd start with something. Well, I'd go second with something fancy, to pretend like I'm fancy. Victorian literature. But what really makes it a story? Here's the point. What really makes a story? If a character is ideological, what really makes it a story is the failure of the ideology. The ideology might pan out by the end of the story. The character might succeed by the end of the story. But it's a story when that ideology fails. So one of the comic book things I would like to talk about is Captain America in the MCU. But there's a really basic example right there. Captain America's American ideology, and even more narrowed down to the ideology of bullies are bad. And for a lot of people, that makes them seem really, really simple. The MCU really proves, arguably, that he can still be a complicated character with this really dedicated, intense ideology really driving him. And the thing that really is effective about that is that with each of the Captain America movies and Avengers movies, that ideology is challenged. It's not quite working out. He knows he needs to protect the innocent. He needs to fight against the bullies, but it becomes a really complicated thing when all of the things all of the stable things in his life are falling apart. But that's also, it's similar to the Robin Williams sort of idea in that his ideology is masking his vulnerability because he's, Captain America starts off as this very small, weak character. And that's true with Jude Fawley. That's true with Horton the Elephant. But Jude Fawley, just to get to the serious one. But Jude Fawley, that whole idea of the book, and it's got a lot of ideas. It's a very, very complicated book. Jude the Obscure. But the whole idea of Jude the Obscure is that you have this very vulnerable, weak character Jude. He's very poor. He's very susceptible to other people's manipulations and that sort of thing. But somebody believes in him and thinks that he could be a great scholar, so that really drives him. He has this ideology that if he becomes a great scholar, he could be a great man. But nobody else believes in him except, very, very few people actually believe that he could succeed. But he's always, he's always facing the system that keeps him from, moving beyond his class and what have you. And he has a streak of fatalism about him. One of my favorite lines from Jude the Obscure. This doesn't seem very similar to Horton, I know, but part of Jude is, this sort of resignation to the fate of misery and what have you. Nobody came because nobody ever came. He's a little kid and he's miserable and he wants somebody to come and help him. And he says nobody came because nobody ever comes. I'm totally misquoting it, I'm sure, but so there's the fatalism, and he has this belief that he can be a great man by being a great scholar. He can overcome poverty. He can overcome all of these obstacles in his way. He can be more than just a mason. But nobody ever accepts him, except for very, very few people, like Sue Bryant. There's the whole complicated love story, and so, spoiler alert, everything fails terribly. Nothing goes well. Everything is bleak and terrible, bad, and miserable, and awful, and then he just dies. Can you believe that? Spoiler alert, he just dies sad. And it is awesome. But you have Horton the Elephant, one of my other favorite characters of all time, who has an ideology. And his ideology, just in Horton Hears a Who, his ideology is a person's a person, no matter how small. Not unlike Jude's ideology. Jude's ideology is much more self-centered in nature, in that he can be a scholar. He can overcome his poverty. He's a person no matter how small. But Horton believes a person's a person no matter how small. So I think Horton's a good example to talk about with this, because I do agree with that ideology. I mean, I that was a very important ideology when I was growing up. I believed in it wholeheartedly, and I still do. A cat's a cat, no matter how small. And then in Horton Hatches an Egg, I meant what I said. I said what I meant. An elephant's faithful 100%. Both those ideologies were very important. Of course, she's knocking things over. She's going to knock over the upholstery man. Don't knock over the upholstery man. This is the upholstery man. This is from a book I wrote, and they're, very similar in many ways. I'm just going to sit here with the upholstery man. She's going to be on the shelf. The upholstery man's going to be on my lap. That's just silly. But what is it, Seiko? But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with the ideologies. So, but this Horton is a story because people challenge his ideologies. The whole world seems against him. So a person's a person no matter how small. Everything within the jungle of Newell is working against that philosophy actually succeeding. Nobody actually believes it. So the actual story is the failure of that ideology. Horton is holding on to that, but he's still dedicated to that ideology. The story is over when that conflict is resolved. There's my other dog, Mackie. Both of the dogs are in here now. They're going to knock over the phone. So, that's different from saying that a story should never be ideological. The story is the conflict between that ideology and the the struggle of the main character to succeed in fulfilling that ideology despite the external challenges. So, like Captain America, Horton the Elephant, Jude Fawley. My dogs are desperate for my attention. There we go. Okay. Every video is just going to be me trying to get Zico out of my face. Yes, I see you. I see you. You're beautiful. And now that I'm competing. So, at the core of the story is a character's feelings and your empathetic experience of those feelings. That's not anti-ideological, but the role of the ideology is to be challenged within the story. But a lot of the times people frame ideology as the sole function of the story. So, like Horton here's most kids' stories, a vast majority of kids' stories. People will frame it as, the whole value and purpose of the kid's story. The whole value and purpose of Horton Hears a Who is to teach the lesson that a person's a person no matter how small. It definitely taught me. I mean, it succeeded on that, but I can still read that story and feel a lot for Horton and, have these intense feelings. I mean, listening, I'll totally confess, I have no shame in this, I'll totally confess, every time I listen to Seussical the musical, I cry a little. No shame in that. True of Man of La Mancha as well. Don Quixote is, more similar in many ways to Jude, really. But from one perspective, it's a totally valid perspective. That is the function of a kid's story. That's not the perspective of the writer or somebody who appreciates the aesthetic value of the art. It's a valid perspective, but it's not. If I were to write a story and say the sole purpose of this story is to teach a person's a person no matter how small, that undermines the whole story. That takes the spirit out of the story. The emotional impact of Horton Hears a Who or Horton Hatches an Egg is that he's so desperate to fulfill this ideology. Nobody actually believes him. Nobody's there to support him. He's totally alone. Nobody came because nobody ever comes. He's sitting on this egg because he's a good elephant. But the whole world seems out to get him. Everything around him seems to be trying to force him to get off of the egg because it's ridiculous for an elephant to sit on an egg. And Horton succeeds. It is a kid's story, so it has a happy ending. So you read a story like that, and you say the point is that Horton succeeds in his belief system. Jude fails utterly. Everything in that book is a total failure. And so you read it and say, the point of that story is that this ideology is a failure. That's an inconsistent universal. So it doesn't work. That's what I'm saying. So from a creative, artistic perspective of an artist, starting from the perspective of saying that this piece communicates this ideology that I want the whole world to agree with, versus saying, here I have a character at the core, there we go, at the core, who has this passionate belief system, and the intensity of emotion comes from the failure of this belief system to pan out, then you have a much more powerful and affecting story. The ideology is out here on the outer rim. It's totally valuable. But the whole trajectory of the story, the way the story works, is these conflicting drives. I mean, that's the most essential thing to recognize about a story. Hi. Most essential thing to recognize about any sort of art is these two conflicting drives. There's a drive towards the center of the rainbow circle, which is a drive to increase stimulation, to increase feelings, to increase empathy with another character, to feel the same thing with somebody else, and increase that stimulation. And I call it stimulation because it can be positive or negative. I love Jude the Obscure. Extremely dark, bleak, makes me sad, but I love it. The parts of Horton's story that I love are the ones that make me worried for his. I have a big elephant right here. Big old elephant. Okay. The parts of Horton's story that I love, that drive me to care about him, are negative feelings. They're worried that he's going to, worried that he's going to totally fail in his efforts. And most of the story is about the apparent likelihood that he's going to fail. He's going to get this whole world killed. And he's not gonna save them. He's gonna abandon this egg, or whatever. He's gonna fail in his ideology that he's faithful 100%. So the actual story is my worry for Horton. So Horton succeeding in that ideology at the end is really just the end. So there's the drive to increase stimulation towards the center of the circle, and there's the drive to decrease stimulation, and those are both pulling against each other. The destimulation is essentially an anti-story perspective. So if an ideology succeeds, that ends the story. So Horton's ideology succeeds. Everybody grows to believe a person's a person, no matter how small. And that shuts off the story because there's no more tension. There's no more danger. There's no more worry for Horton. Because the sour kangaroo agrees that a person's a person no matter how small. Jude's tension is his need to succeed in this plan to be a scholar, or there's hundreds of other things that happen in that story. All of his dreams fail. But that's the resolution of the tension. It's not a success of the ideology. It's a resolution of the tension, and the resolution of our need to support him in his pursuit of his ideology. That's what the story is, not the ideology itself. And you can apply that to Don Quixote. I mean, Don Quixote, is a whole other video, but you can apply that to Don Quixote, the book version. I first grew to love Don Quixote from Man of La Mancha. So that's why I say the book version. It's sort of a backwards trajectory for me. My first version is the musical version. But in the book version, his ideologies fail. I mean, that's why it's similar to Jude, somewhat. And another connection to the Robin Williams movies. I do want to talk about The Adventures of Baron Munchausen one day. But the two Terry Gilliam Robin Williams movies have a similar sort of dynamic in that The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which is probably my favorite movie of all time, if you know that I like Don Quixote. Obviously, I would like The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. But The Adventures of Baron Munchausen has a similar sort of dynamic where he's this world adventurer, but he has this vulnerability of, he's being old, everybody thinks he's a liar, sort of like Horton, everybody thinks he's a liar. Nobody believes him. That gets all complicated. I do want to talk about that. I feel bad I keep going over my favorite movie so quickly, but it sort of fits in that way. The Robin Williams character, the King of the Moon, not really a typical Robin Williams character. There's some interesting things going on with him, but last video I did talk about Fisher King, which is another one of my favorite movies of all time. But that one has a very direct contrast between the manic, crazy, jokey, comedic character that you see with Robin Williams quite frequently. But he's also a knight. He's chivalrous, so he has all these ideologies of what it means to be a knight. But very directly, he's compensating for the intense vulnerability that came with his wife being brutally murdered in front of him. So there's that contrast. So it's not, the Fisher King, spoiler alert, is a happier ending than Jude the Obscure, but But the ending is a resolution of the tension. He wants to get the Holy Grail. Arguably, the Fisher King, the resolution of the tension has a lot more to do with Jeff Bridges' arc, but his ability to make himself vulnerable. They have the same sort of dynamic. I'm slipping into talking about Fisher King once again. They have a similar sort of dynamic in that they're hiding this vulnerability they feel on it with. Jeff Bridges has this abrasive personality on the outside. Robin Williams has this knight character that he's created to compensate for his vulnerability. And so for both of those characters, the resolution of that tension is the willingness to be vulnerable for each other. And, Jeff Bridges gets the Holy Grail for Robin Williams' character, Perry. So that's the important thing to keep in mind. So the trajectory, just to sum up the idea, the trajectory is of the story has a lot to do with that pull between increasing stimulation, so being drawn to the worry for Horton, being drawn for the misery for Jude, wanting him to succeed and become this scholar, being drawn to what is essentially a really miserable story for Jeff Bridges and Robin Williams and Fisher King, that sort of thing. What is really, essentially a miserable story for Don Quixote, who, and they have this costume of ideology that they're trying to get back to some sort of stasis. The whole drive towards that outer ring, the whole drive towards that outer ring of destimulation, manifests in terms of ideology, quite frequently in the character, not always, but quite frequently with the character. It manifests as an ideology, so it manifests as knightly chivalry, it manifests as becoming a scholar, in overcoming poverty, that sort of thing. But the lack of resolution of that ideology, like my animals are destroying something in the other room, but the lack of that resolution is the story. And Jude the Obscure has another interesting level, because it is definitely, it's one of my favorite stories, and I say stories don't need to be rhetorical necessarily. One of my favorite novels, I should say. And I say they don't need to be rhetorical, but that one did have a definite rhetorical purpose. It doesn't have, certainly you could say it's about the class system, but Thomas Hardy definitely had a rhetorical purpose in critiquing marriage taboos. There's a lot of discussion of different marriage taboos throughout Jude the Obscure, about the taboo of divorce, about the taboo of bigamy, about the taboo of living together before marriage, that taboo of marrying your cousin. There's a whole wide range of taboos that the book talks about. And so part of Thomas Hardy's purpose is critiquing the idea that those are taboos, that those are wrong, and showing that, for example, spoiler alert again, both main characters, Jude and C. Bridehead, have bad marriages for different reasons, and they end up together, but they can't marry, so they live together. Then they end up, because everything's miserable and terrible and bleak and hopeless, they go back to their spouses. But clearly it's a bad idea, and clearly that just makes them miserable. So, it's a critique of saying that marriage itself is the great institution. So, Thomas Hardy's purpose, but even in something like that, Jude the Obscure is a very complicated, layered sort of story, but even in something like that, that may be the purpose of the story. The Outer Ring is the rhetorical. The sixth level is the representational, making a universal claim that something is true in all cases. But those two levels, those are the farthest on the destimulating end of the spectrum. So if you actually succeed in that, and that's all that you have, and then there's no pull in the other direction, you don't really have a story necessarily. You have, a rhetorical argument. So, a book that would be purely an argument against marriage taboos as being taboos, or relationship taboos as being taboos, like living together before marriage, that sort of thing. It would just, it'd just be purely an argument. It wouldn't really be a story. But what really makes it a story is the whole idea of these characters who grow to believe that, marriage practices of the time are outdated and inhumane. That would be the key. They're inhumane. They're disregarding the humanity of the people who suffer under these marriage practices. But what makes it a story is the humanity. So it's the desire for Jude and Sue to live together without being married. They want to eliminate the taboos in order to fulfill their more basic visceral desires. The visceral desires are the story. The ideology of the Victorian era is keeping them apart. There's a tension between those two. So the story is the lack of the resolution of those tensions between, the desire and the ideology. The stimulating desire and the destimulating ideology. Do you understand, Maggie? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So, and something like marriage practices, this part of the problem with really treating it purely as rhetorical is that marriage taboos like living together before marriage, that's not a taboo anymore. Not really, and except in some circles, not really a taboo anymore. And so if it's purely a book based, if the value of the book is just that it critiques marriage taboos, that really only relegates it to have historical value, showing, the dissent against Victorian marriage practices. But otherwise it doesn't really age well. What makes it age well, and what gives it duration of stimulation, which I talked about last time, which makes it still a book that I can read, in the last, when did I read it? Last 20 years? Oh, geez. I don't remember when I read it. Maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Something like that. I can read it in the last 20 years or so, when living together before marriage isn't a taboo, and I can still find it very stimulating. I can read a story where ideology fails, and I still find it very stimulating, because at the core of that is a character like Jude, who so desperate to fulfill this ideology, so dedicated to fulfilling this ideology, that it creates this intense amount of tension within the story. And somewhat similar to Tess, and I don't want to get too much into Tess. Tess is on my mind because I'm writing a story, I'm editing a novel called Murder Birds. Murder Birds, that's kind of hard to say it, really, without mumbling. Murder Birds. But I'm editing a novel that in this particular part, it's really influenced by the sort of description of landscapes that you see in Tess especially. The character is very different from Tess, but it sort of echoes Tess in some ways. It's a character working out, it's a female character, young female character working out in the woods. But Tess is kind of a minefield to talk about, because a lot of the issues have to do with feminism. And commonly it's read as an ideologically feminist story, although certainly contemporary feminists would look at it as a sexist story. There's all kinds of complications there, but essentially it's somewhat similar to Jude in the sense that the tragedy of Jude comes from this is Spike, by the way. I don't know if Spike's been on the videos. It's four out of the 6 animals one of them is a cockatiel, and so he's not going to come in here. The other one is a cranky cat. He's not going to come in here. What was that? So, Tess. Yes, the minefield that is Tess. But the ideology, the issue with ideology is similar to Jude in the sense that the taboo marriage practices create the tragic situation, but the story is the tragic situation, and so it's the desire to fulfill. If Jude and Sue lived happily together without any sort of complications, that would be a story. And similarly with Tess and Tess's issue, spoiler once again, very triggery, sort of novel, but she gets raped by her cousin. She has a baby, and the baby dies. It's very bleak, very dark. But what makes it fascinating is Tess is this very fascinating character, and so a lot of feminist friends don't really like how passive she is. So I think she's a really complicated and fascinating character. But what makes her story really tragic is the belief systems of the time, which is that what happened to her is her fault, so she gets all the blame for that. So the tragedy of it is the dehumanization of Tess based on this belief system. So it's our desperate need for her to find some sort of relief from this bleak, miserable system. Sort of like Jude. Jude strives for some relief from this bleak, miserable system. And Jude's kind of, passive, sort of like Tess. A whole other video about why passive characters are not always bad characters. They may just be characters you dislike, but that's a whole other issue. So part of the problem is, that was one of the reasons Thomas Hardy stopped writing, is because of the controversy that came up with depicting these things in a book, which ironically at the time was dehumanizing to Tess as a character, that she on many different levels was being dehumanized by these ideologies, which I would say to purely look at any book as just an ideological book, to purely look at any book as just an ideological book dehumanizes the characters, and I think that's the most effective way for a writer to look at the role of ideology. Ideology, practically as functions to create tension between, the desire of a character to fulfill, a particular goal, ramps up the tension, versus, the system that keeps them from doing that. But to say that it's just purely about ideology, to say that Horton is just about the ideology of a person's person, no matter how small, you're dehumanizing that poor elephant. You're treating him as a non-entity, like the sour kangaroo treats the Who's. But what's human about Horton is, in the context of a story, what's really human about Horton is his desire to fulfill this ideology. And it's, the way that the obstacles to fulfilling this ideology ramp up the intensity of his desire, and his desperation, and his worry, and all these different emotions. So I think that's about it for today. I did my due diligence. I talked about something fancy, and that gives me leeway to talk about non-fancy stuff. All the really non-fancy stuff that I love. I'm sure I'll talk about something fancy later. This is one reason I relate to Jude. I'm just a mason who pretends like I'm a scholar, but not really. But anyway, Maggie and Seiko say goodnight. Good night.